Are you sure about this, Mr. Thompson? Michael's calloused hands trembled as he gripped the pen. The courthouse clerk's voice echoed in the sterile hallway. Beside him, Eleanor Whitmore adjusted her expensive Chanel suit with manicured fingers that had never known honest work. 71 years old, a millionaire widow, and somehow, impossibly, his bride. Sophie tugged at his borrowed jacket. 8 years old, wearing the only dress she owned, a faded pink thing with a small tear near the hem. In her tiny fist, she clutched wildflowers she'd picked from their trailer park that morning. "Daddy, will Mrs. Eleanor really make me pancakes?" she whispered. The scent of Eleanor's perfume, expensive, foreign, clashed with the antiseptic smell of the government building. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her blue eyes sharp and calculating as they studied Michael's face. There was something familiar in that gaze, something that made his stomach twist. He signed his name. The pen felt heavy as a brick. 7 days. That's all it would take for Michael Thompson to discover that marrying for money was the least shocking thing about this woman. The drive back to Riverside Trailer Park stretched out like a funeral procession. Eleanor's BMW led the way, its pristine black paint reflecting the October clouds that threatened rain. Michael followed in his battered Ford pickup, the engine coughing black smoke with each gear shift. In the back seat, Sophie pressed her nose against the window, watching the elegant car ahead with the fascination of a child seeing magic for the first time. The contrast between their vehicles told a story neither adult was ready to examine too closely. Eleanor's manicured fingers gripped the steering wheel with unexpected tension. She had done this dance before, arrived at a man's home, assessed his assets, calculated how long the game would take. But something felt different about Lot 47 on Maple Street. When she pulled into the gravel driveway and saw the aluminum-sided trailer with its sagging porch and hand-painted flower boxes, her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with professional evaluation. This wasn't just another mark. This was someone's actual home. Michael parked beside the BMW and watched Eleanor's face through her windshield. He had expected disgust, maybe polite disappointment masked by good breeding. Instead, he saw something he couldn't quite identify. A softness around her eyes, a careful stillness that suggested she was seeing more than just a double-wide mobile home. When Sophie bounced out of his truck and ran to Eleanor's car window, chattering about showing her the garden she'd planted with seed packets from the dollar store, Eleanor's expression shifted into something almost tender. Inside the trailer, the differences between their worlds became even more apparent. Eleanor stood in the living room, her designer heels sinking slightly into the worn carpet that Michael had shampooed twice in preparation for her arrival. The space that had felt adequate for him and Sophie now seemed impossibly small. The patched sofa where they watched movies on Friday nights, the coffee table he'd built from scrap lumber, the 13-inch television perched on concrete blocks. Everything looked shabby under Eleanor's appraising gaze. But Eleanor wasn't appraising. She was remembering. The careful way someone arranges furniture when every piece matters. The spotless cleanliness that comes from having so little that everything must be maintained perfectly. The family photographs crowding every surface because memories are the only luxury you can truly afford. She recognized the signs of a life lived with dignity despite circumstances, and something inside her chest began to ache with an emotion she hadn't felt in 20 years. Sophie grabbed Eleanor's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen, eager to show off the art corner where her drawings covered the refrigerator like colorful snow. "This is Mommy," Sophie said, pointing to a stick figure with yellow hair. "She's in heaven, but Daddy says she still watches over us. And this is our house, and this is the butterfly garden I want to plant next spring." Her innocent chatter filled the silence that had stretched between the adults, and Eleanor found herself kneeling down to Sophie's eye level, studying each crayon masterpiece with genuine interest. The photograph of Sarah sat on the side table like a gentle guardian. Michael's late wife smiled from the frame, her arm around a much younger Sophie at some birthday party that had happened in what felt like another lifetime. Eleanor studied the image longer than politeness required, noting the warmth in Sarah's eyes, the easy joy in her expression, the way she held Sophie like she was the most precious thing in the world. This wasn't just competition from a memory. This was evidence of the kind of love Eleanor had forgotten existed. As afternoon faded into evening, Eleanor insisted on helping with dinner. She moved around the small kitchen with surprising efficiency, her expensive clothes looking increasingly out of place as she washed dishes and set the folding table that doubled as their dining room. Michael watched her work, noting the little things that didn't quite add up. The way she knew exactly how to stretch hamburger meat with breadcrumbs, how she automatically turned pot handles inward, a habit learned in cramped spaces, the practiced way she dried dishes and returned them to cabinets, as if she'd done this choreography countless times before. Sophie chatted through dinner, asking Eleanor questions with the relentless curiosity of childhood. Did she have children? No, sweetheart, she never had that blessing. Did she live in a big house? Yes, but it was very empty. Did she know how to braid hair? Eleanor paused at that question, her fork halfway to her mouth, and something flickered across her face before she smiled. I think I could learn, she said softly, and Sophie beamed as if she'd just been promised a trip to Disneyland. After dinner, they sat in the living room, the television providing background noise while Sophie colored and the adults navigated the awkward territory of what came next. Eleanor had expected to feel trapped, claustrophobic in the small space. Instead, she felt something she couldn't name. A settling, like a bird finding the right branch. The trailer was tiny, but it was warm. It was lived in. It was loved. When Sophie curled up against Eleanor's side during the evening movie, something inside the older woman's chest cracked open just slightly. Michael made up the couch for Eleanor over her polite protests. As he brought her sheets and pillows, he caught her standing before Sarah's photograph again, her expression unreadable in the dim lamplight. She was beautiful, Eleanor said quietly, and Michael heard something in her voice. Not jealousy, but a kind of wistful recognition. She looks like she knew how to love well. It was such an odd thing to say, and yet it felt exactly right. Sarah had known how to love well, completely, without reservation or calculation. That night, as Michael lay in his narrow bed listening to Eleanor moving quietly in the living room, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. The practical part of their arrangement, her money in exchange for companionship, suddenly felt far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. But when he heard Sophie's sleepy voice calling out, "Good night, Grandma Eleanor," and Eleanor's soft response, he realized that complications weren't necessarily bad things. Sometimes they were just life, messy and real, and surprisingly precious. The morning brought new challenges and small revelations. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen before dawn, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater that made her look younger, more approachable. She had coffee ready and was attempting to figure out their temperamental toaster when Michael emerged from his bedroom. The sight of her in his kitchen, wrestling with the appliance that required just the right touch, was so domestic it took his breath away. This elegant woman who supposedly had staff to handle such mundane tasks was muttering under her breath at a $20 toaster like any frustrated homemaker. Sophie bounded into the kitchen with the energy that only 8-year-olds possessed at 6 in the morning, immediately launching into her morning routine of checking with Eleanor about everything from what to wear to what to pack for lunch. Eleanor answered each question with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, helping Sophie choose between 2 equally wrinkled shirts and packing her lunch with the careful attention usually reserved for state dinners. When Sophie asked if Eleanor would walk her to the bus stop, the older woman's face lit up with such genuine pleasure that Michael had to look away. Watching them together on the front porch as the school bus approached, Michael felt something shift in his chest. Sophie's small hand clasped in Eleanor's manicured one, both of them chattering about the day ahead, looked so natural it was hard to believe they'd known each other for less than 24 hours. When the bus pulled away and Eleanor stood waving until it disappeared around the corner, Michael saw her wipe quickly at her eyes before turning back toward the house. Their second day together established a rhythm that felt surprisingly comfortable. Eleanor insisted on accompanying Michael to his morning plumbing job, claiming she wanted to see how he worked. What she actually did was reveal an unexpected knowledge of pipe fittings and water pressure that left Michael staring at her in confusion. When she handed him exactly the right wrench without being asked, he finally voiced the question that had been nagging at him. "How do you know about plumbing?" Eleanor's pause was barely perceptible, but Michael caught it. "My late husband was very hands-on with repairs," she said carefully. "I picked things up over the years." It was a reasonable answer, but something in her tone suggested there was more to the story. Michael had learned to read people during his years of working in their homes, seeing how they lived when they thought no one was watching. Eleanor carried herself like someone who had money, but she also moved with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste anything, not time, not effort, not resources. The contradiction intrigued him more than he wanted to admit. That evening brought their first real test. Sophie fell off her bike while racing with the neighbor's dog, scraping her knee badly enough to need stitches. Eleanor insisted on driving them to the emergency room, but when they reached the billing office, something strange happened. The woman who had supposedly written an $8,000 check for Sophie's previous medical bills just 3 months earlier suddenly seemed nervous about a routine emergency room visit. She fumbled with her purse, started to say something about waiting, then stopped herself with visible effort. Michael paid the bill himself, watching Eleanor's face carefully. Her relief was obvious, which raised questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Why would a millionaire be concerned about a few $100s in medical expenses? When they got home and Sophie was safely tucked into bed with her bandaged knee and a promise of ice cream for breakfast, Michael found Eleanor standing in the kitchen, staring at an unopened envelope with the logo of some law firm downtown. She startled when she noticed him watching, quickly shoving the letter into her purse. "Couldn't sleep," she said, but her voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with insomnia. "Old business matters. Nothing urgent." But the way she avoided his eyes suggested it was very urgent indeed, and probably not the kind of business a wealthy widow should be worried about. Michael wanted to push, to ask the questions that were multiplying in his mind, but something in Eleanor's posture warned him off. Whatever was in that envelope, she wasn't ready to share it. Their third day brought Mrs. Patterson from the trailer next door, armed with a casserole and enough curiosity to power a small city. The 70-year-old neighborhood watch captain had been observing Eleanor's comings and goings with the intensity of a private investigator, and she clearly had opinions about Michael's sudden change in circumstances. "Quite a step up from poor Sarah," she said, with the bluntness that had made her both beloved and feared throughout Riverside Trailer Park. Eleanor handled Mrs. Patterson's not-so-subtle interrogation with the grace of someone accustomed to nosy neighbors, but Michael noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, and how she carefully steered the conversation away from any specifics about her background. When Mrs. Patterson asked directly how Eleanor had amassed her fortune, Eleanor's answer was so vague it could have meant anything or nothing at all. "Investments and insurance," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Boring stuff that would put you to sleep." After Mrs. Patterson left, Eleanor sat heavily on the front porch steps, looking more exhausted than someone should after a simple social visit. Michael joined her, noting the way she kept glancing toward the main road, as if expecting unwanted visitors. "She means well," he said, but Eleanor shook her head. "She's right to be suspicious," she replied quietly. If I were her, I'd be asking the same questions. It was an odd thing for an innocent person to say, and Michael filed it away with all the other small inconsistencies that were starting to paint a picture he didn't like. The phone call started on day 4. Eleanor's cell phone would ring at odd hours, and she would step outside to take the calls with the urgency of someone handling a crisis. Michael caught fragments of her conversations, heated whispers about needing more time, about situations being more complicated than expected, about children being involved. The tone was wrong for business calls, wrong for social calls, wrong for anything that should concern a retired millionaire. When she came back inside after these conversations, Eleanor looked shaken in a way that suggested the calls weren't bringing good news. Sophie, with the intuitive radar that children possess for adult distress, began asking questions. Why did Grandma Eleanor look sad sometimes? Why did she check the locks on the doors twice every night? Why did she jump when the phone rang? Michael found himself making excuses he wasn't sure he believed, protecting Eleanor from Sophie's innocent curiosity, while his own suspicions continued to grow. Whatever Eleanor was running from, it was catching up with her, and he was starting to wonder if he and Sophie were going to get caught in the crossfire. Daisy brought the revelation that would change everything, though Michael didn't recognize it at the time. While Eleanor helped Sophie with a school project about family trees, Sophie produced the photo album that contained pictures of Michael's father. David Thompson had been dead for over 20 years, but his presence still filled the trailer in the form of the home he'd left his son and the memories that lived in faded photographs. Sophie spread the pictures across the living room floor with the casual ease of a child who had heard these stories countless times. Eleanor's reaction to David's photograph was immediate and visceral. She went white as paper, her hands beginning to shake as she stared at the image of Michael's father standing beside another man Michael had never been able to identify. The silver-haired stranger in the photograph had kind eyes and a familiar smile, and he and David appeared to be close friends. Eleanor picked up the picture with trembling fingers, studying it as if it held the secrets of the universe. "Your father," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What was his name?" Michael told her about David Thompson, about the construction accident that had taken his life when Michael was only 12, about the questions that would never be answered because death had stolen the storyteller. Eleanor listened with the intensity of someone hearing prophecy, her face cycling through emotions Michael couldn't read. When Sophie asked innocently if Eleanor knew who the other man in the picture was, Eleanor's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. She excused herself abruptly and fled to the bathroom, leaving Michael staring after her with a growing certainty that his father and Eleanor Whitmore were connected in ways he couldn't yet understand. That night, Eleanor received the longest phone call yet. Michael heard her pacing in the small backyard, her voice rising and falling, in what sounded like an argument with someone who held significant power over her choices. He caught fragments. "I told you the situation has changed, and there's a child involved. And most disturbing of all, some things are more important than the original plan." When she came back inside, her face was set in hard lines that suggested the conversation hadn't gone in her favor. Michael confronted her gently, asking if everything was all right, if there was anything he could do to help. Eleanor's response was too quick, too rehearsed. "Just old business matters," she said, avoiding his eyes. "Nothing that affects us." But Michael was beginning to understand that everything about Eleanor affected them, and the growing list of inconsistencies in her story was starting to form a pattern he didn't want to acknowledge. Day 6 dawned grey and cold, with the kind of October weather that promised an early winter. Eleanor was already awake when Michael emerged from his bedroom, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and another of those official-looking envelopes. This one bore the return address of a law firm, and Eleanor stared at it as if it might contain either salvation or destruction. When she finally opened it, Michael watched her face cycle through confusion, shock, and something that looked like devastation. "Bad news?" he asked, and Eleanor's laugh was bitter as autumn wind. "I'm not sure," she said, but her voice carried the weight of someone who was very sure indeed and didn't like what she knew. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her purse with the others, adding another secret to the collection that was threatening to overflow. Michael wanted to press for answers, but something in Eleanor's posture warned him that she was balanced on the edge of a precipice, and the wrong word might send her tumbling into an abyss he couldn't follow. Sophie spent the evening teaching Eleanor how to play her favorite card game. The two of them huddled together on the living room floor while Michael watched from the kitchen. There was something poignant about the scene. The elderly woman and the young girl, separated by more than 60 years, but connected by some invisible thread of understanding. When Sophie accidentally spilled her juice, Eleanor's reaction was telling. She flinched as if expecting punishment, then forced herself to relax, murmuring reassurances that were clearly meant for herself as much as for Sophie. As bedtime approached, Sophie asked Eleanor to help her say goodnight to her mother's photograph, a ritual that had become sacred in their small household. Eleanor knelt beside Sophie in front of Sarah's picture, listening as the little girl recounted the day's events to the woman who would never hear them. When Sophie finished and kissed the glass over her mother's face, Eleanor stayed kneeling for a long moment, staring at the photograph with an expression Michael couldn't decipher. "She looks like she was happy," Eleanor said quietly, and Michael heard something wistful in her voice. Like she knew she was loved. It was such a specific observation, and yet it felt exactly right. Sarah had known she was loved, had lived her entire life wrapped in the certainty of family and belonging. "She was," Michael replied. "Every single day." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if filing away this information for future reference, then stood and smoothed Sophie's hair with a tenderness that seemed to surprise them both. That night, Michael lay awake listening to Eleanor move restlessly in the living room. She was pacing, he realized, walking the small circuit from kitchen to living room and back again like a caged animal. Occasionally he heard her voice, too low to make out words, but carrying the cadence of someone having a very important conversation with herself. When morning came, he found her sitting on the front porch in the pre-dawn darkness, wrapped in one of Sarah's old quilts, and watching the sunrise with the intensity of someone who wasn't sure she'd see another one. Day 7 arrived with the weight of an ending, though Michael couldn't have said what was ending or beginning. Eleanor moved through their morning routine with a careful precision that suggested she was memorizing every detail. The way Sophie liked her toast cut diagonally, the angle of morning light through the kitchen window, the sound of Michael's coffee cup clinking against the saucer that had belonged to his grandmother. She hugged Sophie a beat too long at the bus stop, and when the school bus disappeared around the corner, she stood in the street until it was completely out of sight. Michael had planned to spend the morning working on a difficult repair job at the community center, something that would require crawling through the tight spaces beneath the building to replace old pipes. It was dirty, uncomfortable work that he usually tackled alone, but Eleanor surprised him by asking to come along. She claimed she wanted to understand his work better, but Michael suspected she needed the distraction of focusing on someone else's problems instead of her own. What he didn't expect was to find Eleanor in the basement storage area when he went to retrieve his spare toolbox. She was kneeling on the concrete floor beside boxes of old photographs and mementos that Michael hadn't looked through since Sarah's death. In her hands was the picture of his father and the unidentified man, and she was crying. Not the delicate tears of grief, but the raw, broken sobs of someone whose carefully constructed world was falling apart. The basement steps creaked under Michael's work boots as he descended into what would become the most important conversation of their lives. Eleanor looked up at the sound, her face streaked with tears and filled with the desperate expression of someone who had run out of places to hide. The photograph trembled in her hands like evidence of a crime she could no longer deny. In that moment, surrounded by the dusty artifacts of Michael's past, Eleanor Whitmore was about to reveal a truth that would rewrite everything they thought they knew about family, love, and the unexpected ways that fate brings people together. "I know who this man is," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking on each word. "His name was Richard Whitmore. He was my husband." The words hung in the basement air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for 25 years, waiting for this moment to finally consume everything in its path. Michael felt the world tilt sideways as Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength even as her composure crumbled completely. "Richard and your father were cousins, Michael. They grew up together, worked together, loved each other like brothers. Richard talked about David constantly, his brilliant cousin who could fix anything with his hands, who saw the good in everyone, who died too young and too far away for Richard to say goodbye." Eleanor's words painted a picture of a connection that had been invisible to Michael his entire life, a family bond that death had severed, but not destroyed. The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. He sank down beside Eleanor on the cold concrete, his mind racing to process implications that seemed to multiply with each heartbeat. If Eleanor had been married to his father's cousin, if she had known about David, about this house, about the family connection that linked them across decades of separation, then her appearance in their lives was no coincidence. The random meeting at the hospital, the offer of marriage, the promises of financial security, none of it had been random at all. "You knew," Michael said, his voice hollow with understanding. "From the beginning, you knew exactly who I was." Eleanor nodded, her tears falling onto the photograph that had revealed her secret. "The moment I saw you at the hospital, I recognized David's eyes, Richard's jawline. When I heard your name was Thompson and you lived on Maple Street, I knew. But Michael, I wasn't supposed to care. I came here with a plan, and caring wasn't part of it." The confession that followed shattered everything Michael thought he knew about Eleanor Whitmore. She wasn't a millionaire, hadn't been for 20 years. The elegant clothes, the expensive car, the promises of financial security were all part of an elaborate deception that had been her survival strategy since Richard's death left her not only widowed, but financially ruined. "I'm a con artist," Eleanor said, the words falling like stones into the silence between them. "I find lonely men, vulnerable men, and I take what I need to survive. That was my plan with you." But even as she confessed to the deception, Eleanor's story became more complex, more human, more heartbreaking. She told Michael about the 20 years of running, of becoming someone she didn't recognize, of surviving by preying on good people when they were at their most vulnerable. She explained how finding Richard's photograph in the basement had forced her to confront the fact that fate had brought her to the family Richard had loved and lost, to the nephew he had never met, but always wondered about. "I was supposed to take what little you had and disappear," Eleanor continued, her voice steady now despite the tears. "But you and Sophie became real to me. This place became real. And when I realized that Richard had found a way to bring me home even after all these years, I couldn't go through with it. For the first time in 20 years, someone looked at me and saw something worth loving. Sophie calls me Grandma. You treat me like I matter. I haven't mattered to anyone since Richard died." Michael sat in stunned silence, processing not just the deception, but the pain that had driven it. Eleanor wasn't just a criminal. She was a woman who had been broken by grief and circumstances, who had made increasingly desperate choices to survive, who had forgotten who she used to be until Sophie's innocent affection and Michael's quiet respect had reminded her. The anger he expected to feel was complicated by understanding, by recognition of the loneliness that had driven Eleanor to such extremes. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs interrupted their conversation. Sophie's voice called down, bright with 8-year-old curiosity about why the adults were hiding in the basement. When she appeared at the bottom of the steps in her school clothes, having been dismissed early for a teacher planning day, she found 2 adults who looked like they'd been through an emotional tornado. Sophie took in the scene with the directness that only children possess. Eleanor's tears, Michael's shell-shocked expression, the photograph clutched between them like evidence of something important. "What's wrong?" she asked, moving immediately to Eleanor's side with the protective instinct that had made her such a comfort after Sarah's death. "Why are you sad, Grandma Eleanor?" Eleanor looked at Michael over Sophie's head, a question in her red-rimmed eyes. How much truth could an 8-year-old handle? How much honesty was fair to burden a child with? Michael found himself nodding slightly, giving Eleanor permission to explain in whatever way felt right. The decision to include Sophie in this moment of truth felt crucial, acknowledgement that she was part of whatever they decided to build from the wreckage of Eleanor's deception. "I haven't been completely honest with you and your daddy," Eleanor said carefully, her voice gentle despite its obvious strain. "I told you I was rich, but that's not true. I don't have money to make your lives easier. I've been pretending because I was scared that if you knew I was just ordinary, you wouldn't want me to stay." It was a masterful simplification, giving Sophie the essential truth without the devastating details. Sophie considered this information with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice reviewing constitutional law. "But I don't care if you're rich," she said finally. "I care that you make good pancakes and you know how to braid hair and you don't get mad when I spill things. Rich people on TV are usually mean anyway." Her matter-of-fact acceptance of Eleanor's revelation was so purely Sophie that both adults found themselves smiling despite everything. But Michael's questions weren't so easily answered. As Sophie chatted about her shortened school day and Eleanor composed herself, Michael grappled with the implications of everything he'd learned. Eleanor wasn't just broke. She was actively running from consequences that included legal troubles and angry associates who expected her to complete jobs she'd abandoned. The phone calls, the mysterious letters, the nervous glances toward the road, all made sense now, painting a picture of a woman whose past was rapidly catching up with her present. "What happens now?" Michael asked when Sophie had gone upstairs to change out of her school clothes. Eleanor's response was immediate and devastating. "I leave," she said simply. "I pack my things and disappear before my past destroys what you and Sophie have built here. It's what I should have done the moment I realized who you were." But even as she said it, Michael could see the pain the decision caused her, the way her hands clutched at the photograph as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had become liquid. "No," Michael said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "You don't get to make that choice alone. Not anymore." The response came from some deep place he hadn't known existed, some recognition that Eleanor's deception was only part of a larger story that involved all of them. Sophie has already lost one mother. She doesn't need to lose another grandmother, especially not without understanding why. Eleanor stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "You can't possibly want me to stay. Not after what I've told you. Not knowing what I am." But Michael found himself thinking about the last 7 days, about the woman who had made their small space feel like home again, who had treated Sophie with infinite patience and him with quiet respect. That woman wasn't a deception. She was who Eleanor became when she felt safe enough to remember who she used to be. "I want to know who you are when you're not running," Michael said finally. "I want to know who Richard fell in love with. I want to know who you were before you had to become someone else to survive." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something more valuable. It was the offer to find out whether honesty could build something stronger than the foundation of lies they'd started with. The conversation that followed was halting, painful, and ultimately necessary. Eleanor told Michael about Richard, about the kind of love that made you a better person, about the grief that had almost destroyed her when he died. She explained about the bad financial decisions, the series of increasingly desperate choices, the way survival had gradually eroded her sense of self until she'd become someone Richard wouldn't have recognized. Michael told Eleanor about Sarah, about the different kind of love that had sustained him through her illness and death, about the way single parenthood had taught him that being responsible for someone else's happiness was both the hardest and most rewarding thing he'd ever done. They talked about David, about the father Michael barely remembered, but whose absence had shaped him, about the uncle Richard had loved, but never been able to save. By the time Sophie returned from upstairs, they had reached a tentative agreement. Eleanor would stay, not as Michael's wife or Sophie's grandmother, but as someone trying to figure out how to be part of a family again. She would face whatever legal consequences her past demanded, but she would do it with the support of people who cared about who she was becoming rather than who she had been. The next few weeks passed in a strange suspension of normal time. Eleanor met with lawyers, faced the reality of restitution and community service, began the long process of untangling 20 years of running. Michael adjusted to the knowledge that his practical marriage had become something far more complicated and potentially more rewarding. Sophie, with the resilience that had carried her through her mother's death, adapted to the new normal with her characteristic optimism. The truth, when it was finally fully revealed, was both simpler and more complex than any of them had imagined. Eleanor wasn't a criminal mastermind. She was a woman who had been ground down by circumstances until she'd forgotten how to be anything other than a survivor. Michael wasn't a mark. He was family, connected to Eleanor through bonds that predated their meeting by decades. Sophie wasn't a tool in someone else's game. She was the catalyst that had reminded all of them what family could be when it was built on choice rather than obligation. 6 months later, Michael stood in the same courthouse where he'd first married Eleanor Whitmore, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. Eleanor was there to finalize her plea agreement, accepting responsibility for her past while committing to a future built on different principles. The judge was surprisingly lenient, perhaps influenced by the character references from Michael, Sophie's teacher, and the director of the community center, where Eleanor had begun volunteering. As they left the courthouse together, Eleanor looked different than she had 6 months earlier. The expensive clothes had been replaced by practical attire suitable for her new job at the hardware store. The carefully maintained facade had given way to something more genuine, lines of worry replaced by evidences of laughter. She was still beautiful, but it was the beauty of someone who had stopped pretending to be anything other than exactly who she was. Sophie ran ahead to Michael's truck, chattering about the ice cream they'd promised her after the court proceedings. She had adapted to the changes in their household with the flexibility that had amazed the adults, accepting Eleanor's altered circumstances with the practical wisdom that seemed to come naturally to children who had already survived significant loss. "Grandma Eleanor is still Grandma Eleanor," she had explained to Mrs. Patterson when the nosy neighbor had questioned whether Eleanor's reduced circumstances changed anything. "She just doesn't have as much money to worry about anymore." The ride home was quiet, each of them lost in thoughts about how dramatically their lives had changed since that October day when Michael had signed his name to a marriage certificate. The trailer park looked the same, but everything else had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Eleanor was no longer a stranger seeking shelter or a millionaire offering salvation. She was family, chosen and fought for, and earned through the kind of daily decisions that build relationships stronger than blood or circumstance. That evening, they established new routines that reflected their changed circumstances. Eleanor's job at the hardware store meant different schedules, and her community service commitment required careful coordination with Sophie's school activities. But the rhythms of their shared life had become comfortable in ways that surprised all of them. Dinner conversations included discussions of Eleanor's day, helping customers choose the right pipe fittings, and Sophie's progress on the butterfly garden she was planning for spring. Money was tighter than it had been when they'd believed Eleanor was wealthy, but somehow their life felt richer. The meals Eleanor cooked from scratch were more satisfying than the takeout Michael had relied on for convenience. The evenings spent playing cards or working on Sophie's homework projects were more precious than the television programs that had filled time before. The small victories, Sophie's improved grades, Eleanor's growing confidence in her legitimate work, Michael's expanding plumbing business, mattered more than the financial windfalls they'd once imagined. On the anniversary of their wedding, Michael and Eleanor sat on their small front porch, watching stars appear over Riverside Trailer Park. It had become their ritual, this quiet time to process the day and plan for tomorrow, to simply exist together without the weight of secrets between them. Sophie was inside, chattering to her mother's photograph about the successful science project she'd completed with Eleanor's help, including both women in her nightly conversation with easy acceptance. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft in the darkness. "Taking a chance on someone like me?" Michael considered the question seriously, thinking about the path that had brought them to this moment. Their life wasn't what he'd planned when he'd first agreed to marry a wealthy stranger. It was smaller in some ways, lacking the financial security he'd hoped for. But it was also larger, more honest, more real than anything he'd imagined possible. "I regret that you felt you had to lie," he said finally. "But I don't regret what we've built since then." Eleanor nodded, understanding the distinction. She had spent 20 years running from who she was, creating elaborate fictions to avoid facing the truth about her choices. Living with Michael and Sophie had taught her that sometimes the best thing you could do was stop running and start building something worth staying for. Inside the trailer, they could hear Sophie finishing her nightly routine, the sounds of a child settling into sleep surrounded by the security of people who loved her. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, where Eleanor's grocery list was held by a magnet next to Sophie's latest drawing. The television murmured quietly in the living room, where Richard's photograph now sat beside Sarah's, honoring the past while embracing the present. Michael thought about family, about the unexpected ways people could come to belong to each other. Eleanor would never be Sophie's biological grandmother, and their marriage would probably never be a conventional love story. But they were creating something together that felt like home in all the ways that mattered. When Eleanor had first arrived with her secrets and her designer clothes, none of them could have predicted how profoundly she would change their understanding of what it meant to be connected to another person. "What do you think happens next?" Eleanor asked, echoing a question that had become important to all of them. The future was uncertain. Eleanor's legal obligations would continue for another year. Money would always be a consideration, and the scars from their unconventional beginning would probably never completely disappear. But uncertainty no longer felt like a threat. It felt like possibility. "I think we keep building," Michael said, reaching over to take Eleanor's hand. Her fingers were no longer perfectly manicured, bearing instead the honest calluses of someone who worked for her living. But they were warm and steady, anchored to someone who had finally stopped running long enough to discover what she'd been running toward all along. One day at a time. Above them, stars wheeled across the October sky, indifferent to human plans and dreams. But on the small porch of a trailer in Riverside Park, 3 people who had found each other through chance and choice, and the mysterious workings of love continued the quiet work of becoming a family. Sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the most difficult soil, and sometimes the best gifts came wrapped in the most unexpected packages. The story of how a poor single dad married a 71-year-old millionaire woman and discovered something shocking after 7 days had become the story of how 3 broken people learned to heal each other. It was a story about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose, about second chances and the courage to tell the truth, about the surprising places where love can take root and flourish. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and Sophie was asleep, and the small world of their trailer felt as vast and secure as any mansion, Michael and Eleanor would sit together and marvel at the journey that had brought them home to each other. The wedding gift they'd given each other turned out to be the most precious thing of all, the chance to discover who they really were when they were brave enough to stop pretending to be anyone else.